I'm a big fan of circular colorwork yoke sweaters, and if I had to include every single pattern I found to be really beautiful and really worth mentioning, we would be here all day and this video would be like 7 hours long. So instead I decided to keep it short and sweet for the sake of your time and my sanity, and I really hope that this list will help you find your future project, especially with the colder season coming up. And before we start, as always, if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing so you don't miss my future videos. I have a couple of fun other roundups in the works, as well as my regular knitting podcasts, so make sure you don't miss those, and let's get started. I'd like to begin this list with a pattern that kind of started it all for me. It was the first colorwork garment I've ever knit, and it made me fall in love with circular yokes specifically. And it's the Lumme Pullover by Sari Nordlund. I absolutely love this pattern. I actually love it so much that I've knit it twice. It's a very popular pattern, and for good reason, because the instructions are really easy to follow. The construction is straightforward, and of course the colorwork motif itself is really beautiful. It's knit seamlessly top down, starting with the folded neckline, and it has colorwork both on the circular yoke and on the sleeves as well. My favorite feature about this design is how you do your shirt row shaping after you're done with the colorwork, which means that there is no awkward gap in between your collar and the start of your circular yoke, and it looks really nice and seamless. And in general, the thing I love the most about this design is how the colorwork yoke is so customization friendly. The original pattern only has one contrast color, but of course you can use as many colors as you like and really make this sweater look unique. I actually highly recommend you go through the project pages for the Lumme sweater on Ravelry and just see what the people are making and get inspired, because there are so many stunning versions of that pattern out there, especially in regards to different modifications people do and the color scheme they decide to use. There are just endless possibilities with this pattern, and that's what makes it so fun. It's just so satisfying to plan and to choose your colors and to see your vision come together. The pattern is so rhythmic and so easy to memorize. It's symmetrical, and you only have long floats which you have to catch in the middle of the Nordic flower. Otherwise, it's super easy to follow, and I think I managed to finish my first version in less than a week. It was just a really quick knitting experience, and it's also a quick knit because of the needle size. It's designed for worsted weight yarn, with the recommended needle size being 4.5 for the stockinette section and 5 for the colorwork section. But I don't actually, for example, increase my needle size for the colorwork. I find it to be unnecessary. My gauge doesn't really change that much. But the best way for you to determine if you need to increase your needle size for the colorwork is to do this kind of mock in the round colorwork swatch. And I will include a tutorial by Roxanne Richardson in which she explains how exactly to do it and really make sure that you can accurately calculate your gauge before you start the project. The suggested yarn for Lumme is Cascade 220, which is a classic non-superwash worsted weight wool yarn. It's really soft and the color selection is just amazing. It has a super slight woolly halo, and it will fill in the stitches really nicely after blocking, which makes it perfect for colorwork. It's a shame I can't really get my hands on it anymore because it's an American yarn, and it means that most of the stores I have access to either stopped carrying it or didn't carry it to begin with, so it's a shame. But there are other options. For example, you can use Peruvian by Filcolana or Sandnes Garn's Pergint. Both are really nice, durable worsted weight options. As I've said, I've knit this pattern twice, and my first version was much closer to the original design. I only used one contrast color, but I did skip a motif under the main flower in the circular yoke, and I also used another motif from the circular yoke on the sleeves instead of the one described in the pattern, and I just really love how that version came out in general. And the yarn I used was Alpina by Lana Grossa, which is their worsted weight sock yarn, but to be honest, I would not recommend using superwash yarns for colorwork sweaters in general because they tend to stretch. The superwash fibers are just not grippy enough to hold your colorwork in place and fill in any gaps in between the stitches. And even though I, for example, am really satisfied with how the Alpina yarn held up over time, I think it's been about a year and a half since I made my first Lumme, but still every time I wash it, because of course it needs to be washed from time to time, not really frequently, but still I see that it kind of grows just a tiny bit every time. I, again, would much rather stick to non-superwash options, unless, of course, you are sure about the yarn you're using and you're sure about your tension. And the second Lumme pullover I've knit was very different from my first version and from the original pattern as well. I absolutely went to town with all of the modifications I made and the color selection I chose. I turned it into an all-over colorwork sweater by repeating one of the motifs throughout the body and the sleeves. This was a very satisfying and artistic knitting experience for me. I really enjoyed the process, even though sometimes I wasn't really sure that my vision would come together in the way that I intended to, but once I saw the finished object, it was just really rewarding seeing it in its final form, so to speak. For this version, I used Lettlopi, which meant that my gauge was slightly bigger than the original, and I also made it in a bigger size to have this super oversized and cozy sweater. And I used 5 contrast colors. It looks like 4, but it's actually 5 because this beige and this beige are different. And if you want to find out more exactly how I modified this sweater and what changes I've made, I have a whole podcast episode in which I discuss it, so I'm gonna link it in the description for you to check out if you're curious. The second pattern with a similar Nordic flower as its center feature of the colorwork yoke is the Bloom Pullover by Brianna Mason. This one is so beautifully designed, and I love how the main color and the contrast color sort of switch places mid-yoke, and in general how simple and yet intricate this pattern is. This sweater is also knit top down with a folded neckline, and the shaping is done before you start the color work, but it's quite fitting here because you don't start it immediately after the color and there is no gap regardless. It's designed for worsted weight yarn as well, but with a slightly bigger needle size. It calls for 5mm needles for the stockinette section and 5.5 for the colorwork section. It only has one contrast color, but the nature of this yoke makes it really easy to add more colors if you want to, and for example, make one of the motifs stand out more. The main suggested yarn for the Bloom Pullover was unfortunately from Joann's, which means it's discontinued now, but I think it's going to be really easy to substitute it with something else. It basically calls for a fluffy, airy worsted weight yarn, so something like Drops Air or Gazzal Air or maybe KOS from Sandnes Garn would also work really nicely. The only thing I would like to note about this pattern is that, judging by some of the project pages for the Bloom Pullover, I see that some of the necklines look really loose, and this is in no way a shade on any particular knitter or their skills. I know it can depend on a ton of different things. For example, on your yarn specifically, it can just be not suitable for stretchy and like really dense ribbing, but my advice would be to go down even more in needle size than suggested in the pattern. Or for example, what I usually do when I'm not really sure that my yarn will give me enough density and like stretchiness in my ribbing is that I try and create an hourglass shape with my folded neckline. And what I mean by that is, for example, if there are 20 rounds of ribbing on 4mm needles that the pattern calls for the folded neckline, I would instead knit 7 rounds on 4mm, then switch to a smaller needle size, for example 3.5 or 375, and knit the center 6 stitches for like the center of the fold before switching back to 4mm again and knit the rest of the rounds. In this case it'll be 7 more rounds, and this way the shape of my ribbing before I fold it will be kind of resembling an hourglass and will be really cinched in the middle, which means that it will lay much nicer against the neck and it will not stretch as much over time just because the stitches themselves are much smaller. Or alternatively, you can just sew in an elastic and it will also take care of this issue most of the time. Icelandic Lopapeysa patterns deserve a video of their own, so for this one I'm only going to mention one, and it's the one and only Afmaeli. This is an iconic pattern from Lopi, and it also is extremely popular because it offers so many different possibilities for customization and color combinations. This is a classic Lopapeysa pattern knit out of Lettlopi, and it has different color combos ranging from 2 contrast colors to 8 depending on the version you choose, and it also has a really wide size range. It goes from smaller kid sizes to larger men's sizes, but of course sweaters have no gender. And it's also great for using up scraps because depending again on the color combo you choose, for some of the colors you only need a small amount of yarn. Like most Lopapeysa sweaters, this one is knit bottom up. You knit the sleeves and the body separately, and then you join them together into a yoke, which you decrease until you reach the neckline, and you finish with the neckline. And the last step you have to do is to graft the underarm stitches using Kitchener stitch, and that did not sound fun for me, to be honest. I am so used to top-down knitting and the convenience of top-down knitting that sometimes when I see something that is grafted or assembled together, I just find it to be needlessly complicated, and I think it's the case with a lot of modern knitters. So I knew that for me to be able to actually knit this pattern and have fun while doing it, I would need to kind of reverse it into top-down knitting. So I literally just flipped the colorwork chart and started knitting from the neckline, and it's not actually as easy as just, you know, doing increases instead of decreases on the chart. There are a bit more math involved, but I actually have some detailed notes on how I did it on my Ravelry page for this project, so I'm gonna link it below again if you want to check it out and make your own version. Perhaps you would like me to make a dedicated video where I explain it step by step and go into more detail about how to reverse the bottom-up instructions for top-down knitting, because this can be applied basically to any other Lopi sweater and most of the bottom-up circular yoke sweaters as well, so let me know. I knit my version using 3 contrast colors, and I decided I would do it as a sort of an insert of the colorwork yoke instead of making it start right under the neckline, and I really love this effect and like my color selection as well. It was mostly because I needed to use up these yarns, but I'm still really happy with it. I really love this vibrant blue, and it kind of enhanced the flower motif here before the main leaf motif starts, so I just love everything about it. Even though this vibrant blue really pops in this yoke, I actually used maybe like 10 or 20 grams of it in total, so again, it's a great project for using up scraps, especially if you knit Lopi pieces before and you have some scraps of Lopi to use up. And one more important thing to note about this design is that it doesn't have any shaping. It's completely reversible front to back, which means that your neckline isn't really raised in any way, and I wish I'd modified that back when I was knitting it, but it doesn't really bother me that much. It's just something you have to account for. It's knit on 4.5mm needles, with the recommended yarn of course being Lettlopi, but if you don't want to use Lopi, which is completely understandable because it's a really unique yarn and it's really scratchy and toothy, rustic, so if you want to use something else, you can instead go for, again, a worsted fluffy yarn such as Drops Air or KOS from Sandnes Garn. An absolutely gorgeous and trendy Lopi style sweater is the Kindhearted Sweater by Clara Eggers. I am actually this close to casting it on. I can't really get the sweater out of my head. I really try and reason with myself that I'm trying to work mostly from stash and I don't have any suitable yarn for it now, but it's just calling to me. It's a beautiful and vibrant colorwork design which consists of 4 different heart motifs that are kind of blended together in a really neat and really fun way. It's so satisfying to look at. It's intended for 3 contrast colors, and the pattern pictures have samples in both a darker main color and a lighter one, and both look absolutely stunning. It's designed for DQ weight yarn with the recommended needle size kind of ranging, because the designer mentions that she is a really tight knitter, so your needle size may vary, but the row gauge is 23 stitches per 10 centimeters. This one is also knit bottom up, but in a really interesting way, which I think is much more convenient than regular bottom up, like straight bottom up knitting. You actually start with a provisional cast on and start by knitting the colorwork yoke and decreasing until you reach the neckline. You do the neckline, but then you pick up the provisional cast on and knit both the sleeves and the body top down, which means that you can really customize your length. And it also prevents you from having to play any unnecessary games of yarn chicken with your main color, but the reason it's actually done this way is because when you're knitting the colorwork chart with the hearts, you need the stitches to face the right way for the heart to come out the right shape. This pattern actually has a wide selection of recommended yarns, for example Jensen by Isager or Cardiff Cashmere Classic, and just be careful with Jensen because it's really itchy if you're not used to it. It's almost as itchy as Lopi, but still a really nice yarn. But I think here pretty much any non-superwash DK weight yarn would work, or alternatively you can use a combination of silk mohair and fingering weight yarn. Next I have another very vibrant and playful design, and this one is from a Ukrainian designer, so I feel really proud mentioning it. It's the Here Comes the Sun sweater from Olga Putano. This is another sweater that is just calling to me. I can't stop thinking about it. This one is so artistic and so fun. Of course the name is calling back to the 60s, but when I look at it, I immediately think of Art Nouveau stained glass, specifically Ukrainian interpretations of Art Nouveau and later Art Deco. They used to incorporate a lot of different folk and like traditional Ukrainian motifs into their decor and like moldings. They've used a lot of sunflower motifs, leaf motifs, and also wheat motifs in their work. This is just what this sweater reminds me of. The sweater is knit top down, and unlike the previous patterns I mentioned, this one has a lot more color work involved. It has color work both on the circular yoke and on the sleeves under the elbow, as well as on the body before the hem. This one has 3 contrast colors, but I think a 2-toned version would look really fun as well, and it's designed for sport weight yarn with the recommended needle size being 4mm And I can see that the recommended yarn is actually a hand-dyed superwash yarn, which is great because you can use, for example, some advent yarns or just some beautiful hand-dyed yarns you have and you wanted to like incorporate into a project for a long time. But again, you know my thoughts about superwash yarns for Colorwork sweaters. I just can't really in good faith recommend it. I think a nice non-superwash option would be, for example, Vovo or Vovo from Retrosaria. I'm not really good at Portuguese, but another one is Cascade's 220 Sport, which is the same Cascade 220 but in the sport weight. Next I have a pattern from another Ukrainian designer, Teti Lutsak, and I highly suggest you check out her whole pattern collection. She is an amazingly talented knitwear designer and she has her own unique style, and she also incorporates a lot of Ukrainian traditional elements into her designs. And this time I want to talk about her Candelariella Sweater. It has a beautiful and intricate, almost necklace-like colorwork yoke, and it's knit in only one contrast color. It's knit top down with the shaping done before you start the color work, and it's actually designed for a much smaller needle size than our previous patterns. It's intended for fingering weight yarn and 3mm needles, so it's not going to be as quick of a knit, but still I think seeing this yoke come together will really make up for it and will be still a very engaging knitting experience. Also, this sort of design will be a great way to use a beautiful fade as your contrast color, and my only suggestion is that for dense colorwork patterns like this, I would recommend you check the contrast of your main and contrast color, and the easiest way to do that is to take a picture of your contrast color and the main color next to each other and bring the saturation down to 0 to see if you can still see the contrast between them or if they look similar and just one looks darker than the other. In that case, you probably would need to choose a different contrast color for your project. And since we're talking about intricate and artistic ornate yokes here, I want to mention a pattern called Exhale by Rachel Illsey. Rachel is also an exceptionally talented knitwear designer and I love many of her patterns. They're just stunning, but I decided to talk about this one because of its really unique pendant-like center motif at the yoke. This one is also designed for a much finer gauge. It's intended for fingering weight yarns and the recommended needle size is US 3 or 3.25mm needles. It's another design in which you can showcase your beautiful hand-dyed yarns, which sometimes can feel too precious to actually knit up in a project, but here I think it will be really worth it. But if you don't want to use superwash yarns or you don't have any hand-dyed yarns which you want to use, you can instead go for something simpler and non-superwash, for example, Sunday by Sandnes Garn or Mondim by Retrosaria. Come to think of it, I have another yarn option I would like to mention specifically in regards to this pattern and the previous one, and it's Life in the Long Grass Moon Base, and it's one of the best hand-dyed yarns I've ever used. It's super luxurious. It's a merino silk blend, and if I were to use it again and like splurge on it again, probably something similar to the Candelariella Sweater and the Exhale Sweater would be a design I would go for. Short row shaping to raise the back is done before the colorwork starts here, and it only has this pendant motif at the front, so technically if you don't want to do it, you can just repeat the chart for the back at the front, but I would definitely leave it in. I think it's one of the most beautiful features of this design. And next I want to move on from ornate colorwork patterns and talk about this absolutely adorable design called the Pusteblumen, and it has a dandelion yoke which is just so beautiful and is so fun to look at. The dandelions here are so well designed. I think you can really see the airy and sort of fleeting nature of these flowers in this pattern, and I absolutely love it. This one is also a top-down knitting pattern and you have only one contrast color, but if you want to increase the flowery nature of this yoke, you can instead use 3 different contrast colors. For example, green for the stems, yellow for the smaller flowers, and of course white for the dandelions themselves. Unfortunately, because of the nature of this colorwork motif and the graphic dandelion, it's not going to be as rhythmic and intuitive or symmetrical as the previous patterns I mentioned, but I think the fact that you could literally see this dandelion grow before your eyes will really make up for it and make it a really pleasant knitting experience. The sweater is designed for sport weight yarn with the recommended needle size being 3.5, and the suggested yarn is Lamana or Lamana. I'm just realizing that I've never pronounced this word out loud, so I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, but it's, let's say, Lamana Roma and Lamana Como Cashmere, which are both really soft, and they will make a really nice and luxurious knitting fabric. A more minimalistic flowery yoke pattern is the Lupin Sweater by Hanne Rimmen. This one is actually in my queue, but I'm not so sure now because I definitely have decision paralysis from looking at so many beautiful colorwork yoke sweaters, and I also for sure have materials for part 2 in 3, so let me know if you would like to see that. I can deliver if you want me to. I just love how minimalistic and in a good way understated this design is. It also kind of reminds me of cross stitch because of the graphic nature of these lupin flowers, and this yarn combo in general also looks kind of rustic to me. And I think for this design it's better to keep its two-toned look. It only has one contrast color, but honestly only with this design I have learned that lupins can be red, because I have only seen them in purple and maybe like slightly pinkish purple, so I learned something new about lupins thanks to that pattern, and I think this red is just gorgeous. The sweater is knit top down with the shaping done after you finish the colorwork yoke, but you actually start knitting it from the colorwork yoke and pick up stitches for the neckline later to have this nice Italian bind off at the end. The colorwork chart is actually really easy to follow. It's super short and narrow, which means that you can memorize the repeat easily, but there are I think 5 or 6 rounds where you have to catch your floats because there are long gaps in between the color changes, but otherwise it's one of the simplest patterns in the list, if not the simplest. The recommended yarn here is Isager Tvinny held double plus a strand of silk mohair, so 3 yarns in total held together, or alternatively you can use any DK weight yarn or a combination of yarns that give you a DK weight fabric, and it's knit on 4mm needles. And last but not least, I want to mention a really fun and whimsical pattern called the Coffee Lovers Sweater, and it's by Tomomi Yoshimoto. This is a very trendy and graphic sweater with coffee beans as its center feature, and it's absolutely adorable. The yoke here is very deep and it has a wider body and narrower sleeves, which is kind of typical for Japanese patterns like that, and I know not everybody loves this look, but I actually am a big fan of that. I think it can look really flattering if you do it correctly, and it's something I try to mimic for my second Lumme sweater. I try to make it kind of as boxy as possible. The colorwork here extends past the yoke and is continued both on the sleeves and on the body, and if you want to, you can actually add an extra repeat to make this an all-over colorwork sweater, and it's designed for 2 contrast colors, but unfortunately the color selection is quite limited if you want to keep the coffee style look. Or you know what, and I'm completely serious right now, you can make a British version of this sweater by using shades of red and orange, maybe a little bit of yellow, to make a bean sweater instead of a coffee sweater. So you know, just take this idea if you want to. Don't thank me. But if you want to stick to the coffee themed version, you will have to probably be limited to shades of brown and beige. The recommended needle size here is 4.5, with the suggested yarn being sport weight, but I'm not actually sure if it's sport weight or not. At least according to Ravelry it's sport weight, but I don't think that's the correct weight to knit on such a large needle. But the gauge described in the pattern is 22 stitches per 10 centimeters. Well, that's the end of our list, and thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I had a lot of fun making it, so I really hope that you found it to be helpful and inspirational, and if you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more. I would really love to see you here again for my future videos. You can also follow me on Instagram or check out my Ravelry page. Actually, as a kind of PS to this video, I wanted to mention one pattern that didn't make the cut, no pun intended, and it's the snip sweater by Bristol Ivy, which has a yoke consisting of fabric shears and scissors, and it looks really fun. But unfortunately, the more I looked at this pattern and the more I kind of scrolled through the projects of people who knit it, I realized that it has a lot of negative feedback and a lot of issues with the fit specifically, so I can't really in good faith recommend it, but I still think the yoke looks really unique and fun. So perhaps if you're somebody who can modify or like draft patterns for yourself, you can take the chart and like buy this pattern for the chart. But again, I'm not really recommending it as a standalone pattern that you can follow from beginning to end, so I have kind of mixed feelings about that one, but I still think it looks really fun, so I wanted to mention it at least as like a postscriptum or something. And otherwise, I wish you happy knitting and a lovely day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.